growth becomes so much more important if you have an aging society, because societies will get poorer if we don't have productivity increases. Like productivity increases can make up for a smaller population. You can still have positive GDP growth if you become more productive. And we're going to need that if we have fewer people to do stuff. As I said, our living standards will start to really decrease if we don't find a way to sort of continue to grow and we have fewer people.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Karabell, the founder of the Progress Network, joined as always by my co-host, Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And What Could Go Right is our weekly podcast in conjunction with our weekly newsletter, What Could Go Right. Please scurry to your computer and sign up for the newsletter. It's free, it's weekly, it's a good dose of things that are going on in the world that you may not have paid attention to or attention had not been drawn to, that are going right in the world, in a world where we do tend to focus when we focus on the news. And the news tends to be what's going wrong, and what are the crises, and what are the challenges, and what are the problems. That's accentuated in an election year, which we are in the United States. In fact, a lot of the world is in an election year. More people will go to the polls in 2024 in aggregate democratically than has ever happened ever in human history. That's probably a good thing and should certainly be seen as a good thing, even if the results don't always please everyone. Democracy is, after all, a constant process of some part of the population getting what they want and another part of the population not getting what they want. There is no way around that in a democracy. There's probably no way around that in life. Anyway, every week we try to look at different issues, culture, politics, economics, international relations, and talk to people who have unique perspectives on what's going on in the world. Many of those people are members of the Progress Network. Many are not, and not all of them think that things are going right. In fact, many of them are focused on all the things that are going wrong. We are not attempting in this to pretend that there is not much that's going wrong, and we want to talk about issues that are animating people. One of the issues that is animating everyone in 2024, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, is the cost of living, the role of government, the problem of inflation, what inflation is going to be, whether or not we are going to be able to meet our needs commensurate with what the price of things that we need is and what income we are earning. And the questions of like, what exactly is this thing we call the economy doing is one of the great debates of our time, particularly given that most people have a different personal sensibility about what's going on economically than what the data is telling us, i.e. many people in many parts of the world think things are quite bad economically, and the economic data that we use as a gauge is telling us that things are quite good economically. And there is a huge gap there that remains unanswered and hard to explain. So we're going to talk to someone today who has unique insight into these questions. Emma, tell us who we're going to talk to today.
So today we're going to talk to Allison Schrager. She's an economist and also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Her writing has appeared lots of different places, but right now she is a columnist for Bloomberg and also writes for City Journal. She's also the author of a book called An Economist Walks into a Brothel, and she's the co-founder of the Life Cycle Finance Partners, which is a risk advisory firm. So are we ready to go plumb Allison for her wisdom?
Yes, we are. Allison Schrager, what a pleasure to be having this conversation with you, or at least I assume it's going to be a pleasure to have the conversation that we're about to have with you. You are one of the more eclectic, unique, unusual voices talking about all things economic for your columns for Bloomberg and City Journal. You also have one of the unequivocally best book titles of the past decade plus that I can remember, of An Economist Walks into a Brothel, which is just such a delicious title for a book. You did a piece recently on the negative economic long-term consequences of kids living with their parents. Maybe expand on that one, because I thought that is like a perfect iteration of all things Allison.
Oh, well, thank you. Such kind words. I was doing a column for Bloomberg about finance TikTok, and I got surprised by a couple things about it. One, that I'm not on TikTok, so I don't consume it often, but I was shocked the financial advice was not terrible. It was actually like pretty standard personal finance advice. And in fact, maybe more digestible and easier to understand than normal. But
Can I
what the
cut you
other
off
thing,
for 1 second? You're not
yeah,
on TikTok because you're against TikTok, or you're just not on TikTok because you're not on TikTok?
well, a combination of the both. I mean, I'm against it, but I'm probably not against it because I'm not on it. Like if I liked it and enjoyed it, I'd like Twitter. I'd probably be like, it's not so bad. But like I'm not on it anyway, so it's easy to be against it.
That's how I feel. I'm on TikTok and I love it. For personal finance, for everything.
Yeah, like if I was loving it, I'd probably rationalize everything. But because I'm not, I'm like, it's evil and it's corrupting the youth. But the personal finance TikTok is not, at least what TikTok steered me towards with its algorithms was actually pretty reasonable advice. The thing that shocked me about it was like they kept talking about living at home, like what is like a viable financial strategy, or like, well, if you are living at home, this is how you do things. Like this is a normal thing. And I looked again and like I knew there's a big upshot of people living at home during the pandemic, but it's been trending up for a while. And it struck me with the TikTok that this is like a social norm now. Like not everyone's living at home, but it's not weird or a source of shame too, as opposed to when I was in my 20s. Like this would have been like only something that happens if your life fell apart, like you lost your job or you got a divorce, and you definitely like had a lot of issues on the dating market. But now it's just like a lifestyle financial choice that seems like totally acceptable. I mean, I guess in some ways I think about, I'm like, oh, I would have saved a lot of money, I guess, if I didn't pay all that money for those terrible apartments I had in my 20s. But if you told me then, like, why don't you live with your parents to save money? I would have thought that was insane. I mean, I guess people live at home in Europe for a long time, or people like lived at home until they started their own families for, most of time. But it does seem to me that, like striking out on your own is an important part of adulting. Making rent is a big motivator to push your career forward. And just general independence and risk taking, it seems like something's being lost there, or it's a sign of people not really fully individuating or being willing to take risks. I was at my university board meeting and a new theory was floated that I don't know this is true because I don't like to generalize too much because, every generation has a lot of different viewpoints and preferences, that universities, get a lot of flack for like investing in really fancy dorm rooms. Because when we were in college, like we lived not in squalor, but it wasn't exactly nice. You had like several people in a room. You shared a phone in a bathroom, and the rooms weren't that nice. They were like cinder block and kind of dark. But now it's like people just live in really nice dorms, and then the apartments they can afford, probably aren't that great. So living at home might also be compelling because you can still live in a nice place. And the idea that you'd live in like a terrible apartment with lots of roommates just is now like maybe also just not a price you would pay for independence. It just feels not worth it. And that does seem like an important, like I said, cultural shift in this build in terms of ambition and risk taking. Although I guess we'll see how it plays out.
What percentage of millennials is that? I mean, I know you said that it was rising, but is it a significant portion of the population?
So for men, it's about 20%. And for women, it's about 12.5% ish.
Okay, that's higher than I was expecting. I mean, how much do you think that that's related to this general story that we hear about, I think particularly millennials and Gen Z, that the upfront economic costs of becoming an adult in the United States are so high that it's just not possible? Meaning the rents are so high, healthcare is so high, college is so high, and it's just like kind of a albatross around those two generations next.
Well, there's some validity to it. I mean, first of all, the healthcare costs, I don't buy because, I mean, you can be on your parents' healthcare well into your 20s now.
True.
And even this student loan stuff, I don't really buy that either. I mean, it's true that people today have much more student loan debt than before. But I mean, if you have a student loan, that's correlated with higher earnings. So I'm not sure that's a reason why. Also, I mean, the proliferation of these income-based repayment plans ensure that you can also pay rent and pay your student loans. So I think I don't really like, I'm not entirely sure. It is true rents are higher and significantly higher than they used to be. But, you have options. Other than living with your parents, you could live with roommates or like not live in a nice apartment or move in a cheaper area. I think it's just, a different norm that, I just, it wouldn't have been an option for me when I was young. Like, despite whatever financial situation I was in, I just would have found a way to live on my own because I just would have been embarrassed. And now people aren't. And again, maybe there's some advantages to that. I mean, it's nice to be close to your parents. When they do have families, maybe they'll be closer to your parents. Their parents will be more involved. There's all sorts of evidence that that's a nice thing. But I think there are also definitely going to be downsides.
This kind of segues into another piece you wrote recently about taking on the issue of wages have been rising somewhat in step with inflation going up, which is one of the pushbacks that people who are saying, hey, the economy is better than people feel. Everyone's focused on headline inflation numbers. They don't focus as much on the degree to which their wages have gone up. And you wrote a piece saying it makes total sense that people would simultaneously benefit from rising wages and be upset about rising inflation. So maybe expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, what a financial economist would call a disconnect between macro and finance. So, like, the whole central premise of financial markets and how assets are priced is that people prefer or don't like risk. Like a risky stream of income, all else being equal, is not as desirable as a sure stream of income, and you will pay more for that sure stream of income. And we just this is sort of undergirds all financial theory. So if you think about what it's like when you're in a high inflation or volatile inflation environment, or you just have a big bump of inflation, you don't know what prices are going to be, effectively that turns your income into a much riskier income because the whole point of income is what you can buy with it. So effectively, like every financial transaction or sort of consumer transaction you're having is now has a level of risk in it. So even if you have a real wage increase, in risk-adjusted terms, is what we would say, it could still feel like a decrease because you now have all this uncertainty. Like you just think in the last couple of years, you know, eggs were like $7 and they were $3 and $2, and you still see, as I said, a lot of volatility in sort of consumer goods, particularly around groceries. I also wrote about how, well, grocery prices have been coming down quite a bit and are now at a relatively decent level of inflation. The cost of dining out is still quite high. That inflation rate's still 5%. And I mean, something really extraordinary happened in the last couple of decades is dining out became a very sort of sort of big part of people's lives of all income levels. I think it now accounts for 50% of food spending, at least going into the pandemic. So, I mean, this is also something that's important to people's quality of life. And things like that are still very expensive. So I think it's not surprising that you can have a real wage increase that keeps in line with inflation. But if you're exposed to more risk and uncertainty, you're still going to feel worse off. Not to mention that the things that matter to your quality of life are still really expensive, all of which are going to make people unhappy. And I think that's understandable.
Although it's remarkable how fast that shift to eating out, not as a luxury item, but as an expected part of just everyday life happened, because I remember when I was growing up, we never ate out. I mean, it was extremely rare. Yeah, any thoughts on that? How quick that was?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of theories, like the rise of fast casual is one, and just as I said, this proliferation of sort of cheaper restaurants. And maybe that wasn't good because we definitely got fatter, and it's better to eat at home, probably healthier. But, I don't think we can deny that people find it convenient and they like eating out. I wrote in this column I did for Bloomberg in which, they indulged some taxi cab reporting, which I hate, but I couldn't help myself, I can't remember what city I was in, but an Uber driver who was just yeah, I mean, my wife and I, it's always been very sacred to us that we have this date night once a week where we go out for burger and a beer. Nothing fancy. I'm not trying to invoke Kyle Bass or David Brooks about ridiculous bill I had at a hotel. This is just a normal guy who, would go out for burger and a beer with his wife once a week. And this was very important to them. It's just very in their quality of life. And he's it was $40. Now it's $80. And they still do it, but it's kind of a big financial strain. And as I said, restaurant inflation is still going up. So, before, I mean, a couple decades ago, maybe they would only do a date night once every 6 months, but doing it once a week has become a thing for them and it's important to them. And now it feels out of reach or definitely a bigger financial strain. So I don't think it's shocking that he would still be upset about inflation, even if he's being told all the time, well, Uber prices have gone up. Why are you complaining?
I've spoken a lot over the years to audiences and tried to give some sense of you can simultaneously be hugely discontent with your economic system in the present and recognized how dramatically, at least in material terms, things have improved over the past 100 years, let alone the past 20. That present tense discontent with what rewards and or the lack of them are, and recognize change. Have you done any work on this, or have people done any work on this? Are people cognitively able, collectively or individually, to step back and go, oh, right, I'm now eating out once a week. I used to eat out every 6 months, but my once a week is more expensive than it was 2 years ago. But I'm still doing it more than I was 20 years ago. Like, are people susceptible to, in a good way, that kind of toggling between the bigger picture trend and the immediacy?
I don't think so. Like, I haven't done any rigorous work on it, so I can't like cite any research, or as I said, I read it, but I don't think people really
If
do
rigorous
have
research were the criteria for making profound and cogent statements on podcasts and television, there'd be a lot of dead airtime.
Yeah, so I'm just going to make stuff up. Anecdotally, I don't think people do have that awareness of what things were like 20 years ago. Like, if anything, you hear people all the time talking about how much worse things are, as if the 80s were like some like wonderful time. Like, people don't remember what the 80s were like. I mean, I wasn't very old then, but I don't remember them being that great. I mean, not that many people had air conditioning, and we didn't have like phones. Cars weren't that safe.
Hey, thanks to these airbags here, this job is now a piece okay, Claire. No more dashboard du jour or Vince under glass, huh?
But Vince, look out! Even with airbags, Vince, you still got to remember to buckle your safety belt.
Now you tell me.
You could learn a lot from a dummy. Buckle your safety belt.
I mean, it was better than the 50s. So like, we were happy because we liked progress. Certainly I see this a lot with retirement, is people had this like golden era of retirement in their head, where allegedly everyone had this like wonderful, rich, defined benefit plan. But like that never happened. Like, people have sort of romanticized the past and don't really realize like things were not that great. I mean, I think it's hard to argue that the quality of life now is worse than it was in the 80s, but I seem to read upteen articles claiming that things are worse in every way when they seem to be better to me in every way. And I mean, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe, there's something evolutionary reason to have humans always be striving for more. I mean, if there's one thing that's been remarkable about humankind, and particularly since the Industrial Revolution, is these sort of dramatic increases in quality of life that have unfolded, even in our lifetimes. And maybe that comes from this constant feeling of not feeling like things aren't good enough and they should be better.
I mean, I always think about forget asking people to be comprehensive about what the data was like in the 80s. People aren't comprehensive of what the data is like now.
Yeah.
Even people that care about data. I find it difficult for a lot of things to like really get a clear picture of what's going on.
Yeah, and it's maybe we're meant to be unsatisfied, and that's healthy because that pushes us for more. Because if we're just content, that wouldn't be good. I mean, it's like the degrowthers. They're just like, we've had enough growth. We don't need to grow more. I find that more destructive and like sort of toxic than things should be better than they are, people.
Although on that degrowther question, one, there's certainly a moralistic aspect of growth is destroying the planet materially and climatologically, and therefore there should be degrowth because its growth has been harmful, or it is beginning to consume the very resource that we need to continue growing. I do want to ask on that, because it is a kind of a relevant one for the next 10 to 20 years, that in large swaths of the world, right? Japan, Korea, China, Germany, England, population is shrinking. I mean, we're in an aging population and then a declining population. Should there be economic growth for a declining, aging population, either systemically or normally, meaning fewer people presumably consume less? And this is a totally separate question to the degrowthers who are saying there should not be growth because it's bad morally because we're destroying the planet, or because it's leading us into a consumerist culture that's removing us from the spiritual connectivity or the larger issues in life. I'm just asking the question of, in a system where there's fewer people with fewer material needs, why should there be growth?
I mean, we still want improving life, improving prosperity. And I mean, I'd tell the degrowthers, if we want to, the definition of productivity is using our existing resources more efficiently. If we want to sort of help the environment, growth is important. Growth becomes so much more important if you have an aging society, because societies will get poorer if we don't have productivity increases. Like, productivity increases can make up for a smaller population. You can still have positive GDP growth if you become more productive. And we're going to need that if we have fewer people to do stuff. as I said, our living standards will start to really decrease if we don't find a way to sort of continue to grow and we have fewer people. It's not only good for the environment, it's good for our quality of life. I mean, especially as we're all getting old, I mean, innovation is going to be important. We're going to need sort of different ways of technology to help take care of us, to hopefully live even longer and sort of live even sort of higher quality. Think of like how old your grandparents seemed, like in their 70s versus people in their 70s now. But it is true in a lot of ways. Improving our quality of life, improving productivity, economic growth is our best shot to make that happen.
Fun fact, this is a massive TikTok trend right now that talks about how slowly millennials are aging compared to their forebears. So I like to think that it's just like we're getting healthier. As you say, we're living longer lives. But of course, it does bring issues as you're bringing up, how are we going to pay for everybody? But I wanted to talk about...
Yeah, like, remember that show Maude? Like, I wasn't old enough to see Maude, but I see clips of it. Like, Bea Arthur was 47. She looks so old.
Yeah,
like,
there's a massive video going around on TikTok and Instagram right now where someone brings up the cast of Cheers that were supposed to be like 30 years old, and they look like someone you would imagine to be 50 years old now.
Yeah, I mean, you see, like, or I was some James Bond villain looked like he was about 75, and they're like, he's 42. I mean, like, Reese Witherspoon's like 50, and she looks great.
Allison, I wanted to ask you in particular about Social Security because it's definitely in the news right now with the presidential election coming up. There seems to be this fear that it's about to combust, but you had it in one of your retirement myths in a column that you wrote. I don't know how old it was, actually. So tell us the good news about Social Security.
Well, I don't think it's going anywhere. I mean, first of all, worst case scenario, we just sort of don't do anything. That would be a 22 across the board benefit cut for everyone, which would be bad. I don't think we should do that at all. But that's a lot better than Social Security, like going bust and not getting anything. And I don't think that will happen. I feel like when you look at pensions, particularly state pensions, they somehow always get paid. We might like default on bondholders or certainly cut services to younger people, but pensions always somehow get paid because older people are very powerful and no one likes to see them get their pensions cut. So I think we'll find a way. The question is, are we going to find a good way to do it? And are we going to do it in a way that's like most efficient? Like, as I said, like, are we going to spend more than we need to fix it? And I think that's a question. And I'm not heartened at all by the political debates on it now. I feel like the conversation is sort of terrible. But I am optimistic that people will get their money. It's just going to be more expensive and messy and unpleasant than it should be.
So there are two main things going on. One is, and we've talked about this repeatedly in our podcast, and I think you've reflected on this, whether you call it the vibe session or the disconnect between how people feel this thing we call the economy is doing and what our data says the economy is doing. And obviously there's a huge divide there. But there's also COVID kind of scrambled a lot of macroeconomic assumptions about spending, about what the effects would be. There's still a completely unresolved, and I imagine will continue to be unresolved debate about, was there a tipping point of all the spending that was done in 2020 and 2021 and into 22? Was the massive amount of spending in 2020 not inflationary, but the spending of the Inflation Reduction Act, which wasn't really about inflation at all. It was about climate change. That was too much. Was the spike in inflation actually transitory? Except the problem with using the word transitory is no one ever defined exactly how long transitory is. I mean, life is transitory, right? Everything is transitory. It's a matter of what your time frame is. So in a completely like big picture way, given that government spent more money in 2020 into 22 than had been spent certainly in the entirety of whatever we call the New Deal, some more Keynesian spending than ever before. It clearly lifted people out of poverty. It had an inflationary effect, but maybe the inflationary effect was just as a result of like a lot of money before people could spend it. What do you make of all this? Did it show that governments could spend more money than they're spending and we shouldn't be worrying so much about spending? Did it prove that if governments spend too much, it creates inflation? I don't know. Like, what is there ever going to be any consensus about this?
I think there is a consensus about it, at least for like credible people.
Ooh.
It's complicated because inflation had a lot of fathers. It was to some degree that COVID disruptions and, issues with the supply chain that got resolved in taking the economy on and putting it back online. And I think that bit was transitory, however we describe it. But I think there was also a big piece of inflation that was from government spending. I think Jason Furman says it's like 2 or 3 percentage points of the 8% inflation that we had was due to government spending. So, there are a lot of different things going on at once. And I see, like, honestly, like amongst like a lot of economists consensus around that. I mean, you have, Olivier Blanchard, who pre-pandemic was like, we can just spend, it's great, being like, maybe we can. And I think the spending went a little out of control. As I said, you see Democrats and Republicans. Larry Summers, definitely was concerned about this. I think a lot of economists do think, and I'm among them, it was justified to do a lot of the spending in 2020. I mean, we shut down the economy and like unemployment was really high. And, you had to do something. And financial markets were freezing. And I'm not a QE fan, but I understand why that was done then. The question is why are we still doing this in 2021, let alone 2022? And particularly as the economy was taking off, why were we pouring more fuel on that fire? So I think it gets confusing because you can't just say inflation was all the government's fault. It wasn't. And you can't say inflation, it was completely transitory, because it wasn't. It was a lot of different things going on. And I think what you have to do is sort of separate them out. I think in general, people are going to have to wake up in a couple of years that we sort of, the last 10 years, sort of lived in this world where there were no economic trade-offs. And I think that's what happens when you have effectively a zero rate environment is you don't pay for risk, you don't pay for capital. So you end up in a world where people think there's just no trade-offs. Like you can spend as much as you want and you don't have to pay for it. That, you should be able to get upside without risk of downside. And I think this just became pervasive in a lot of things. It didn't last, though. Like, I don't think we're going back to a zero rate environment. I see a lot of consensus around that to be doubtful that that's going to happen. And if that's the case, then we do start having trade-offs. Then we do see that, if you do run up debts, it does have an impact on the economy because interest rates go up and that can be contractionary. Or if you do want to take, have, higher wages and sort of take risk or have higher asset returns, you are going to have to face downside risk. So I think the vibe became this sort of idea that, we could do all these things and there was a free lunch everywhere. My colleague at Bloomberg just wrote a great column I loved that was called like, say it loud and say it proud, I'm a neoliberal. He was saying how this non-neoliberalism, the statism, is this idea that like we can just have this free lunch, like the government can direct resources to industries it likes and we'll have more growth and no downside risks to that. I said we can spend without inflation or raising interest rates. You can take risks and you won't have any downside. And you know what, like neoliberalism, he argues, was always about acknowledging that there was trade-offs. And, we have to sort of long run be a little bit more prudent and thoughtful about our policies. I think that era is coming to an end. Not right now, because we're still sort of living in it. But I think we definitely see elements that, certainly the high rate environment that isn't going away suggests that that's not going to stick around forever.
Allison, I'm wondering if you could tease out another piece of the economic puzzle for me. You're talking about how inflation had many fathers and you kind of need to tease out what caused what. Something that I have not been able to figure out in the post-COVID environment, and I'm not by any means an economics expert, so this might be a very obvious question, is all these like papers are coming out now that wage growth sort of skyrocketed between 2019 and 2023. It used to be pretty stagnant. Now it's at 10, 12%. What caused that?
Well, again, different fathers. I think, 2019, the Trump era, I just did this data thing for Bloomberg, and the Trump regime actually was the only regime of all the presidents since 2000 that had positive wage growth for everybody, all income levels. I mean, not everyone, but like all income levels, particularly lower income people who hadn't seen a lot of wage growth in years. Now, I think on the margin, maybe the tax reform had some benefit, but I'm of the view that was just, again, there's always different reasons for everything. I think most of the reason was it just took a really long time to come out of the financial crisis. And I think Trump had some good timing of, financial crisis. I think the economy had finally recovered. I think a lot of technology initially impacted higher wage people. I think it started to trickle down finally to lower wage people. So I think pre-pandemic, we saw just a lot of that, like just good timing. And I think on the margin, I think the tax reform did do some nice things, but I think it was marginal but useful. But really, it was just where we were in this cycle. And then the pandemic came, and I feel like we're now in a very different economy where there's just a real shortage of labor, particularly low skill labor. So they're just making a lot more money because there's not that many of them, and there's a huge demand for service jobs right now. I think that's why people are putting a lot now on immigration, sort of filling that hole, but still not enough. Actually, since the pandemic, higher and middle high earners haven't had a huge wage increase. In fact, I think they're still having had a real wage decrease. But we are seeing in the lower end some big wage gains, I think just because there's a shortage of their labor.
So on this, kind of back to where we began the discussion of your recent piece about people can simultaneously benefit from rising wages and also legitimately be discontent with rising inflation. Nonetheless, it's almost impossible to have significantly rising aggregate wages and zero inflation. So there's got to be a level of inflation where you kind of go, this is a good thing. And zero inflation probably isn't a good thing unless you are degrowth or if you believe that there should be no growth, because yes, you could continue to have lots of productivity growth and low inflation. You probably couldn't have wage growth and low inflation, right? You could have lots of productivity and no inflation. And, we could debate whether or not the cost of capital was kept artificially low for the 10 years prior to the pandemic, or whether it was just a product of kind of technology and globalization where cost of capital was low because it was actually just low, meaning not because central banks were manipulating it. There's a lot of capital. And there still is a lot of capital. I mean, we live in still a largely capital-rich world, even with 4% interest rates rather than zero. I mean, we're not talking about the 1980s here. We're not talking about the 1970s or for much of the time before that. I mean, interest rates are still historically on the low end, right? They're certainly not anywhere near the high end. So maybe this whole idea of we need to get back to a 2% inflation rate, which is what the Fed and all central banks globally are saying. Maybe that's the wrong number. Maybe it's 4%. I don't know, but why isn't that conversation being had more actively? Like there's a normative sense of inflation is high because the number that we decided that inflation should be is below what it currently is. But we just made that number up anyway.
Yeah, we did. I think we're starting to have that conversation. I'm starting to notice it. It's going to take a couple more inflation reports. I think the Fed is hoping it was going back to 2, and now it seems to be stalling out. And I personally don't see how it goes down lower. Like, it was going down because we had all these deflationary forces, partially from coming back online from COVID, but we saw a lot of goods price deflation. And I'm not sure I see, but we still had high service inflation, which again, largely driven by wages and things like that. So now that goods price deflation has pretty much moderated, we still have the high service inflation. So I'm not sure if I see inflation then stalls out around like 2.5%, 3%. But I think you're right. Like, there's no reason why 3 is worse than 2. In fact, even before the pandemic, a lot of people were arguing for 4. So I'm of the view, again, like, inflation is a sign of a healthy economy. We don't want inflation to be 0, but what we want inflation to be is relatively low and predictable. The predictability is key. We want it relatively stable, and we want it to, like, in theory, I mean, if inflation was 5%, and everyone knew it was going to be 5%, and we could like constantly, not have to worry about that, that wouldn't be a bad thing. Although higher inflation does tend to be more volatile, so it's not a good thing. But assuming it could be, it doesn't really matter. It matters that it's predictable. And it seems like the Fed has chosen it, I guess. Although I'm starting to rethink that. I was a big fan of inflation targeting. And yeah, we chose 2, although the Fed's never really gotten to 2. It was like below 2, and now it's above 2. And like, it's never really been at 2. So I'm not like sure the Fed has as much control over inflation. I'm starting to think that inflation was so low from 2000 on just because we had a huge deflationary shock called trade with China. And now that the gains from that are not so apparent going forward. So inflation might just be higher. And now the Fed has to have this conversation of, oh, well, maybe not 2, maybe 3 instead. And in theory, that's fine. If we're just like, it's 3 and it stays at 3 and the Fed targets 3, then, there's nothing wrong with that. And I feel like the economy is in pretty good shape. Is it really worth taking it into a recession just so we can go from 3 to 2, especially if the economy just naturally wants to be at 3, just doing 2, just so we can prove the Fed can do it? Some people would say yes, because I guess credibility is important. Although I'm starting to feel like, does anyone really think the Fed, if you look carefully, when has the Fed ever made its inflation target? And so if they just go to 3 because like, well, we can't make 2, then, I mean, what's the point of inflation targeting? It seems like you can't make it. So people who, smart people I know who are in this are like, well, soon you're going to see them starting to massage the language. It's like, well, we meant a range, like 100 basis point range. And that's probably where we're going to end up.
Did we say 2? I mean, yeah, I guess we said 2, but we didn't really mean 2. We meant 2 as kind of a notion of 2 that could be 3, but it could be 1, but it could be 4, but it might be 0.
We meant between 1 and 3 with 2 in the middle.
So, Allison, I want to ask you one more question about retirement because it's a topic that's really on my mind right now.
You planning on retiring? Kind of, is it you're thinking about early retirement, Emma?
Well, I have been trying to early retire since I was 21 years old. So that's a fun fact about me. But I was telling Allison before we started recording that I recently realized that I made an incredibly dumb mistake calculating for my retirement. And fortunately, it was in the category of oversaving instead of undersaving. But it did bring the question to mind for me because I started reading a book about it, which is, what is the state of Americans in terms of retirement? Because I feel like the popular narrative is that they're a disaster and they don't save enough. But there's also, I mean, the rise of employer matching, the rise of automatic enrollment into 401k. Apparently, the younger generations are doing better with this. So I was wondering if you have any data points to share with us about it.
Well, it's like we were saying earlier about you don't want to romanticize the past. It's like, I think people should have more money for retirement. They probably don't have enough money to have the retirement they want, but they still have way more money than anyone else ever has had for retirement. So things are better than before, but could still be better. Like the old days, I guess the defined benefit days in the 70s and to some degree the 80s, only 30, 40%, depending on how you measure, of people had defined benefit plans. And they only really were valuable if you stayed at a company for most of your career. And even then, you had the risk. Defined benefit plans went away because they were very expensive. And companies didn't want to acknowledge how expensive it was to bear that risk. Like people were finding out what's a lot of risk to manage your retirement. Well, yeah, it's expensive and it's hard to provide a risk-free retirement. And when companies had to do it, they kind of were in denial of how expensive it was. And then they kept, like, you had these big blowups. People didn't get their pension. And that's really bad. So the government pretty much redid the regulation and forced companies to realize how expensive this really was. And once they did that, they're like, oh, we don't want to do this anymore. We're going to put this on individuals. And the benefit of that was that it was cheaper. So way more people now have retirement accounts than ever had defined benefit plans. More people have savings than ever before. So that's good. And that's one of the reasons, like, evidence does show that retirement income is higher than it used to be. Of course, people also live longer. People are very reluctant to increase the retirement age further. So they need more money. And healthcare costs are a much bigger deal. And long-term care costs are enormous and not covered by Medicare. And a lot of people haven't really thought that through. I think all these problems are fixable. We just aren't really focused on it right now. But it could be worse. It could be, before. And somehow people did get by. So I think people will be okay. Definitely, there's more we could do to make it better.
Allison, it's been a real pleasure to have you speak with us today. You're someone who I feel like we could probably talk about almost anything and come up with nuggets of unusual insights and unusual takes that are, if not counterintuitive, things that a lot of people don't look at. I know you come from both a traditional economics academic background plus the work you've done in Wall Street and finance, but you kind of have a way of looking at things that is unusual and I find continually insightful. Makes me think about what's going on in the world in a different way. And that's of immense value to everyone. So for whoever has not read Allison's work, she does a column for Bloomberg, as we've said. She also does some stuff for City Journal. I think the Bloomberg stuff you probably have to pay for, which is a good thing. Content should not always be free, even though this podcast is. And I look forward to continuing to learn from you as I have in the past. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. So that was a really fun conversation. I feel like we were dipping in and out of a lot of different topics, and we kind of went around her major topic, which is risk. That's what her book was about. We didn't get to ask her so much about it, but I feel like she is a rare economist who is interesting to listen to, right? She's not a very serious person, as you mentioned in the beginning. And she's fresh, and she's clear. She explains things in a way that I think makes sense to people who are in the web of intellectual economist, whatever the heck, and just a normal people, that she can say that, well, people want to eat out more. Duh. That's why they're upset about inflation.
Yeah, and this idea of risk, again, as you said, we didn't really get into it with her because there were much more immediate things to talk about. But the thing is, like, people's attitudes about risk, and we did talk about this a little, of what a zero cost capital environment for a decade led to. We all essentially want the benefits of taking risks without the taking risks. Like, we want all the things that come with outsized risks, i.e. the outsized gains, but none of us really want to take those risks because we don't want outsized losses. We all want everything, but not at the cost of having nothing. And then we can lionize a few people who seem to take outsized risks. I mean, whether or not you love or hate Elon Musk, part of what made him so enchanting to so many people for a while is that he did put everything on the line at one point in time to build Tesla and to go for SpaceX. And we think that's cool, right? That someone's risks paid off. Of course, we never really lionize the gazillion numbers of people who wanted to do that and wanted to be that, and it didn't work. Like, there are lots of unwritten books about lots of human beings who tried and risked everything and got nothing. There's no book about that, oddly enough.
Yeah, I mean, I've met a decent number of startup founders, you meet them 3 years later, you're like, what happened? It's nothing. No one's going to write any book about them. They basically had a job that led to nowhere. But anyway, she writes a lot too, which we kind of got into, but didn't get deeply into, the question around risk in retirement. It's a fascinating topic to me because on the one hand, you don't want to undersave, right? You don't want to be 90 years old, realizing you live longer than you meant to, and now you have these enormous healthcare bills that you can't pay for. But you also don't want to have all this money, waiting for you, and then you die when you're 75 and you retired when you were 70. Maybe if we have her on again, she can give us some nuggets of wisdom for how to plan in the best way.
So, shall we look at some of the news du jour?
Yeah, let's go. So, Zachary, I'm sure you remember that not too long ago, there were a lot of freakouts in the news and with individual sort of activists around colony collapse, that we were going to basically lose the support of honeybees in the United States, and our agricultural systems were going to collapse because we were running out of bees. You remember that?
I did read it. I do remember that. There was like the whole, oh my God, the bees are dying. It's like the beginning of one of those apocalyptic sci-fi films where someone casually sees the bees dying and thinks nothing of it, and then the next scene, society has collapsed utterly, and we're all living in huts in the Mojave Desert.
Exactly. So we lived through the first scene, but we did not make it to the second scene. And new data has come out that we actually have a record number of honeybees in the United States, and that is talking about livestock bees, so honeybees so they're essentially like cattle. Their populations are taken care of by a vast industry. So that data is for those honeybees, but they also think that feral honeybees or wild honeybees are also populous, reaching high numbers. So long story short, no need to worry anymore. The honeybees have been handled.
Honeybees are here. They are more abundant now in the world than they have ever been. There are honeybees everywhere.
Including social media, where #beekeeper has racked up billions of views. With more people picking up beekeeping as a hobby and booming demand from the pollinator from the almond milk industry, honeybees are now the fastest growing livestock segment, according to analysis from the Washington Post.
And do we know why there has been this sudden reversal?
There's a few different reasons, one of them being agricultural tax breaks. Not such a sexy answer, but the sexier answer, and a big reason, actually has to do with the supercharging of almond tree farms. Oddly enough, the American public got obsessed with putting almond milk into everything, That led to people trying to meet the demand. And that led to hyperpollination, which led to the health of honeybee colonies. So there you have it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have expected that one. Huh.
Yeah. If people are interested, Washington Post has a really interesting article on it, their Department of Data, if they want to read the whole story.
Wow. All right.
Yeah.
So honeybees are back and flourishing.
Moving on, it is becoming readily apparent that Thailand is going to become the first Southeast Asian nation to legalize same-sex marriage. Their lower house of parliament passed a bill not too long ago, and they expect that there is not going to be any resistance for that bill passing through the Senate and then being signed into law by the king. So that's pretty historic.
It is pretty historic. I mean, granted, the king of Thailand is... Okay, we won't even go into Thailand's incredibly messy political system, but at least for the time being, the king has done something that we would consider to be correct.
Yes, and to be fair, Parliament did put it through before we, got into the king signing. Anyway, good for human rights. We won't get into the other governmental authority questions about Thailand. And then last but not least, not sure how far this news traveled around, but it's very interesting. The Census Bureau has updated the forms for the first time in 27 years for the census around the questions that have to do with race and ethnicity. So they did some probably things that really needed to be done a long time ago, like strike the word Negro from forms. Apparently they had not been struck out, which is wild. But also what they did, which is going to actually affect people's responses, is that you can now tick multiple boxes. So they combined all of the race and ethnicity questions into one. So let's say you're Black and Hispanic, you can tick both. They also added a lot more categories for people that might be Middle Eastern and North African heritage. Previously, they were just told to check the white box, which obviously is a little bit of a overly broad brush to paint for people, let's say, from Lebanon. So now there have been a demarcation of categories, and they think that people will be much more accurately able to say what is their race and ethnicity.
Yeah, of course. What's interesting about that is at the same time, you have a greater ability to actually identify where you're from and who you are, let alone the whole, 23andMe effect of people now being aware of all these things that they weren't aware of before, and simultaneously in the United States of not being able to use those categories anymore because of the rollback of affirmative action that was supposed to create racial preferences. So I don't know what to make of that other than ever more chaos, like more information, less policy, more policy, less information. I don't know. What do you think?
I think anytime you have something that leads to more comprehensive data, it's a good thing. I just think there's the more that I look into data in the United States, the more I'm convinced that there's an absolute dearth of good data, particularly on the federal level. So I am actually just 100% pro this.
All right, then. More data.
So that's what we got for today. More data, more problems. We say no.
So thank you all for listening. We will be back with you next week. Please sign up for the newsletter. What Could Go Right? It's free. It shows up weekly. Gives you a dose of things going on in the world that are a little more constructive, a la the brief rapid fire headlines that we just discussed. Please send us ideas, send us critiques, send us comments about the newsletter, about the podcast, things you would like to have addressed that we have not, or that you want us to delve into more that we have. We hope this is a conversation with you, at least as much as possible, and not just a conversation at you. So we look forward to the feedback and the engagement and continuing to build an idea movement that hopefully leads to a more constructive future rather than a worse one. So thank you for your time, and we will be back next week. Emma and I will.
Thanks, everyone.